Good morning, everyone. Whenever you're ready, if you could take your seats. Good morning again and welcome. Thank you all for joining us on a day which no doubt will be both emotionally and politically challenged. I can't say the word political. Politically challenging for all of us. And I must once again express my appreciation to the fine staff here at the FCC for their unwavering commitment to this agency and to our nation. We're here this morning to discuss a very important topic: the cost associated with reassigning broadcasters new channels following the incentive auction. We've lined up two panels of industry experts who will walk us through the complicated topics of transition and cost reimbursement. One of the central goals of our incentive auctions is to ensure a healthy future for the broadcast industry. And one of the ways in which we hope to do this is by covering the reasonable costs that some broadcasters will incur to change to their newly assigned channels after the auction. In support of the latter goal, Congress has set aside $1.75 billion to reimburse broadcasters for these costs. We are committed to administering that fund as promptly and as efficiently as possible. In fact, Congress gave us only 3 years to distribute these funds, meaning that we've got to hit the ground running. We can't do it without the industry's help, however, so we're all truly in this together. We have been advised to plan early and often with respect to our reimbursement program, and this is what this workshop represents. There remain many challenging questions about the transition and its costs, and one way we're addressing those is through the proposed catalog of expenses we put out for comment last week. Holding today's workshop is another step in the process. By working hand in hand, we can ensure the smoothest transition possible, and I remain confident that this historic auction will be a huge win for both broadcasters and the American people. And at this time, I'd like to invite my colleague, Commissioner Pai, to say a few words. Commissioner Pai.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thanks to the Incentive Auction Task Force led by Rebecca, who I mistakenly called Susanna a few minutes ago. I'm operating without coffee, for which I apologize, but she's far more essential to this operation than I ever could be in the parlance of our times. But I did want to thank you all for coming to and participating in this relocation workshop. Obviously, this is one of the most complicated auctions that has ever been structured, that's been said enough that I think it's become a shibboleth for most people in Washington. But I think relocation in particular is an especially complicated component of that. If I could indulge you by telling a quick story, last year I was in New York City, and we went to the top of the Empire State Building, courtesy of a well-known broadcaster, and they showed us some of the pipes leading up to the very top of the tower. And they said that, in order to switch from one channel to another, it's not a matter of somebody sitting in a back office flipping a switch on a computer and then just cutting to the new channel. You actually physically, in this case, have to cut the floor at the 85th floor, I think it was, of the Empire State Building. Create enough of a platform for you to be able to move some of those pipes over. It was a really exhaustive effort, and that's one of the things that I didn't really appreciate until I physically saw it. All of which is to say that the public notice that the chairwoman mentioned in terms of the catalog of eligible expenses, the discussion that's going to happen today in terms of what kinds of hard and soft costs are going to be incurred by broadcasters in the context of relocation is really, really important. And I hope that both today and in the days to come, the record is burnished with a lot of good commentary on how we should think about these components of cost. Because for us to be able to get it right, for us to be able to adhere to the strictures that Congress set out for us in terms of the $1.75 billion and other protections that broadcasters get, we need information. And so I want to thank you once again for all coming here, participating in this endeavor, and we will look forward to working with you in the days to come and getting it right, hopefully, in the 2014 or 2015. Thanks.
This. Can I get this on? Oh.
Are we live? Okay, great. Well, I'd like to echo Chairwoman Clyburn's comments and Commissioner Pai's comments in welcoming you here today. A few technicalities I'd like to point out. This session is being webcast live at www.fcc.gov/live. And it will be archived and available tomorrow. If anyone here in the audience has any questions for any of the panelists at the end, please step up and use the microphone there. But for our web audience, you can submit questions to our email box, livequestions@fcc.gov. Both the chairwoman and the commissioner mentioned that we issued a PN last week, and I'd like to reiterate that we really do expect and hope that you will submit comments on that PN. It's essential for us to build a record on eligible cost reimbursement. That will be crucial for us to build a rulemaking on that. We don't expect any of today's panelists to have formulated any definitive comments on that PN, but what we do hope to accomplish is to create a dialogue with these industry experts about a broader set of issues relating to cost reimbursement. This panel represents the very industries that will determine the success of this transition. And with that, I'd like to introduce them to you. We have Joe Davis, who is president of Chesapeake RF Consultants. Joe is a television and radio consulting engineer with over 30 years of experience, and he provides analysis of transmitter and tower site relocation, facility upgrades, signal propagation, interference evaluation, and human exposure to RF electromagnetic fields. And he's also working with Widelity on some survey work that Widelity is doing for us right now. Of course, we have Jane Mago, who's Executive Vice President and General Counsel of NAB. And Jane directs the work of the NAB's legal department and is responsible for all aspects of NAB's legal strategy. Peter Stark is Vice President for broadcast of the American Tower Corporation. Peter also has over 30 years of broadcast experience in the tower space. He's been involved with the development, construction, and operations of some of the most complex broadcast towers in the world. And finally, we have Joe Zuba, who has 30 years of experience in broadcasting. He is National Sales Manager at Dielectric. And at Dielectric, he works closely with stations in small and large markets, large station groups, FCC consulting engineers, structural consultants, installation contractors, etc. So hopefully we can take advantage of the great experience on this panel this morning. As we sat down to think about what we want to talk about this morning, obviously we have an interest in managing very prudently this $1.75 billion fund. And in determining what new equipment we would provide reimbursement for, we first asked ourselves, well, is there anything that broadcasters will still be able to use when they transition to new frequency, or at least those that do? So, for example, a broadcaster might be able to reuse their existing transmission lines, or there might be components of an interim facility that may be able to be used on the new channel. So, to what extent, what do you think will be the opportunity for reusing any equipment in these or maybe other scenarios? For example, in the area of transmitters? Joe Davis?
Well, Rebecca, thank you very much for inviting me to be here today. I'm sure we're going to hear some very interesting items through the next couple hours. Regarding reuse of transmitters, let's use the phrase retuning for a moment, because we're interested in changing a transmitter's operation from one channel to another. And let me explain a couple things for a moment. The ability to retune varies quite widely between equipment and manufacturers. The key to it is manufacturer support and parts availability. We do know that there's a number of transmitters in the field that are orphaned. They're no longer supported, or the manufacturers have gone out of business. You're pretty much on your own there. But for those who do have support, one of the items that must be replaced is the mask filter. It costs about 5 to 10% of the original cost of the transmitter. There's several suppliers for that. Should be no issues obtaining those. And some transmitters require only minor parts to change the channel. It's a matter of adjusting directional couplers, making some calibrations, and going forward from there, resetting the exciter to the new channel. But I have to tell you that there are many transmitters in the field that, practically speaking, can only be retuned for a few channels to what's known as banding issues. And without getting too technical about it, within the transmitter there are internal systems that, for instance, a UHF transmitter may have subbands across the UHF band where it may be useful only for the high, the middle, and the low parts of the band. So the first thing we have to do is see if we have banding issues with a particular transmitter before we can retune it. And the same is true for certain VHF transmitters. They might be only useful on the adjacent channel. We basically have two issues when we have these major banding issues. Are you going to replace all the guts to the transmitter is basically it. You're going to take out the engine and the transmission and put all new stuff in. And is the manufacturer still around to even support that effort? And the cost of replacing these items in many cases, if it is supported, can approach the cost of a new transmitter. And the other thing is the underlying components within the amplifiers. Many of those 10, 12 years ago were made at the time, are no longer being available. The transmitter manufacturers have a supply of spares for servicing the transmitters in the field, but they're unwilling to devote their supply for a huge retuning effort because then they wouldn't have any spares for lightning strikes and servicing the equipment in the field. There are tube-type transmitters that are still in use in the higher-powered UHF stations. The tubes themselves, of course, are broadband. We have some minor banding issues with those relating to the input and the output coupling on those. We can usually overcome those. Again, we need the support from the manufacturer. Those transmitters also use the same solid-state drivers to provide lower power levels to the tube outputs. And those drivers also have the same banding issues that we discussed before. So when we look at the opportunity to reuse equipment, some of the manufacturers estimate maybe 30% or so of the transmitters in the field can be retuned to a new channel. The best case in that case is to use the transmitter by the same station rather than trying to market it or repurpose it and use it for a station that may be across the market or across the state. But the question about reusing transmitters by other stations also comes into some other challenges where you have timing issues. Station A, who might be releasing a transmitter, has to wrap up their transition. We have to transport the transmitter from one place to the other. Have to make sure that the long-term parts are available. And then is anyone going to stand behind it? Is this equipment going to be just made available as is? Is there any sort of warranty coverage? So there's a lot of challenges to work through. The other case you raised regarding interim facilities, many stations will require interim facilities to get them over the hump of completing their transition. And in the ideal case, the interim facility can be used on the new channel so that the equipment will still be operational in the long term, perhaps as an auxiliary.
That's useful. How about in the area of antennas or maybe transmission lines? Joe?
Yep. Again, I likewise would like to thank the FCC for inviting me to be here today. It's very much appreciated. Let's start with the easiest part of the chain, that's the transmission line. Typically, the transmission lines are built in either 20-foot, 19.5-foot, or 19 3/4-foot sections during the installation process. They typically can be used at other channels, but there are specific channels that those lengths will not work at. So while there's a good chance that the line can be reused, it will be dependent upon what channel is eventually assigned. Will also be dependent upon the overall length of the line. How tall is the tower? Some of the elbows may need to be rechannelized or replaced because typically elbows can be channelized as well in the line. On the antenna side, The vast majority of the UHF antennas out there today are slotted cylinder type antennas. These are channel specific, very custom designs. Possibly they can operate plus or minus one channel, but generally beyond that they cannot. There is a small percentage of antennas out there that are broadband panel types. I'd put that on about 5 to 10%, so they are a little bit more frequency flexible and can be used at other channels. Joe had mentioned the inside RF equipment that goes with the transmitters, the mask filters. They are very channel specific. A question has come up, can we retune those in the field or replace just the cans, so to speak, the filter portion of those mask filters? Yes, you can. However, the difficulty becomes staying on the air while you're still doing this transition. And the difficulty is also field service people to do that work. There are probably a half a dozen people in the field qualified to do that kind of tuning. So while a lot of the inside equipment can be retuned, the difficulty will be how to stay on the air at the same time you're trying to do that. So with respect to existing equipment, transmission line, it's a good possibility you could reuse it. For the antennas, it's probably doubtful. In any case, any equipment you have, if you think you could reuse it, it's a good idea to have it swept electrically before trying it, to see if it will work at the new channel, to see if you have to make any changes, any upgrades, especially if the equipment is more than 10 years old. You'd want to do that anyway.
So it sounds as though between transmitters and maybe some of the transmission lines, there may well be an opportunity somewhere, potentially. To the extent there is, what is the role of the FCC in determining where those opportunities are? How could you help us figure out how we manage who we think can reuse or retune some equipment and who can't? But also, if one station is reusing equipment, would that trigger us to ask other stations if they can't reuse their same equipment?
Joe can answer also. I would think that's part of the reimbursement application process, that when a station does apply for a reimbursement for equipment, that they describe what their existing equipment is and why it can't be used. And obviously somebody at the FCC there'll have to be someone technical there to be able to evaluate the application.
Well, by and large, the transmitter and antenna make model information can be revealed, and it's a pretty simple task to go back through some of the historical or manufacturer data to say, well, that model number is clearly a single-channel slot antenna. We can't, and it's currently on channel 50, we can't use it on channel 32. There's just no way. It's a no-brainer. And the same is true for some of the transmitter manufacturers, where it's well known that some of the manufacturers use these banding techniques in their construction, and you can't go from channel 50 to 32 without replacing a considerable amount. So some sort of inventory with makes and model information, and that can be established pretty easily.
So it sounds like there are some black and white cases of what can and can't be reused based on physics. But to the extent there are any gray areas, like the equipment is getting sort of old, a broadcaster might want a new one, is there any is there a role that the FCC has in actually encouraging equipment reuse where there might be a gray area?
Let me try to step in here, because I've been listening to some of the answers, and I think that perhaps there's a little more gray area than you're suggesting. Because as I was listening to some of the points here, there's a realm where there's a theoretically possible reuse of equipment, and then there's a practical, and some of that practical is not related to just the equipment itself, but actually to the ability to have it be retuned. I think that Joe Zuba said a minute ago that there's a very limited supply of folks that may be able to do some of the retuning, if that's even a feasible option. I think it is incumbent on the FCC to think about this as you go about the repacking process of how far someone's being asked to move, because Joe Davis's point here, that you can only go so far in terms of banding and changing, reusing equipment. Is something that can be kept in mind, I think, as a part of the repacking process, and I think that that's something that can be done. It's also a matter of the timing that we've only got 3 years to try to figure all this out. And again, what I heard a moment ago was talking a little bit about, well, you have to, do an electronic sweep of the equipment, make sure it's feasible. If you've got to order something ahead of time and get it in the pipeline, you're going to have as much time as possible to be able to do that. So knowing where the channel placement's going to be is going to be an essential element to all of this. And I think it's really going to be crucial for the FCC to work with the broadcast industry to get the table of allotments out as quickly as you possibly can, to give us as much time as there may be if you even want to go down this road. And I have a feeling that this is going to become far more impractical as we go along, because the equipment that theoretically could be retuned may not be actually in shape to be able to do that. So not to be a wet blanket here, but it does seem like there's a lot of things that have to be taken into consideration. And I don't want to see too rosy a picture about the idea of reuse.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, practicality-wise, when you have equipment that's been previously used by analog or current digital stations on towers, if it's no longer in use, it's always sort of been our policy to keep that equipment in place and keep it serviceable. We've had relatively minor success in repurposing equipment because there's another analog to digital transition going on right now, and that's with the low power TV stations. So we've been able to take some of the out-of-core equipment during the full power analog to digital, and that out-of-core equipment was left on our towers. We were able to repurpose it and continue to try to repurpose that equipment for some of the low power digital transition. We have to remember we were talking about whether the equipment is old and whether somebody wants new equipment. Well, most of the digital equipment that's out there on towers, transmission lines, and antennas are relatively new as it goes by TV antenna and transmission line standards, because typically these transmission lines and antennas could last up for 20 to 30 years. So we've had some minor success on leaving equipment on the tower and repurposing it. But again, because of the technical reasons Joe and Joe brought up, we do run into situations where that equipment will not mate up with whatever the new use is or purpose.
Jane mentioned that broadcasters who are moving won't really know what new frequency they're moving to until the end of the auction. So in light of that, is there anything that vendors can be doing now to have equipment ready in the right volumes, even though there are still some unknowns with respect to the repacking? And similarly, is there anything that broadcasters can do today to prepare for their equipment purchases so that vendors are not overwhelmed all at once at the end of the auction?
That's a very good question. It's very difficult. With the original DTV transition, as you know, we knew that every station had to transition to a second channel. So, and there was a phased implementation at that time by market size. So we knew both the volume and we knew the timing. And we had a couple of years, 2-3 years to ramp up for that. Right now, we don't know the volume pending the auction results or the timing. And then you throw in the freeze on the current freeze to changes for existing stations. And what we currently have in the industry is a contraction in all phases of the industry. In manufacturing, on the structural side, installation side, and even consulting fields. Now, having said that, can the industry ramp up? Absolutely. I mean, we certainly have the capacity to do that. In the original transition, we were shipping over 300 antennas a year. But until some of the volume and timing issues are known, it's very, very difficult. What we've been doing, and I know what other manufacturers have been doing in the meantime, is trying to focus on anticipated product needs, on R&D, to try to determine what kinds of RF products might be required as the industry transitions. More broadband products, perhaps products more geared toward ATSC 3.0, whatever that brings. What can broadcasters do today so that vendors, when the time comes, are not overwhelmed by orders and by this wave? I go back to the original transition when we saw that wave coming. Back then, there were quite a number of group vendor agreements that took place between groups and antenna suppliers, transmitter suppliers, installation contractors, and structural analysts that gave the groups preferential deliveries and pricing based upon volume. I would anticipate that something like that might transpire again as we get closer to the actual repacking starting to happen.
Anybody else? No? So when a broadcaster is assigned a new frequency, it may be that to cover its same coverage area, it might need to install new equipment that wasn't part of its original facility. And if we're talking about reimbursing for reasonable costs for replacement equipment, how should we be looking at new equipment that the broadcaster never had to have before based on its previous coverage? And, where should that fall in terms of the reimbursement fund and how we look at whether that's reasonably a reasonable reimbursable cost?
I don't think you'll be the least bit surprised to hear me say that it's absolutely within the cost. I think if it's going to be shocking. Everything I say today will be totally shocking to everybody in this room. I'm pretty sure of it. If a broadcaster is required to have new equipment to be able to serve the contours that they have post-repacking, certainly it was contemplated in the statute that there would be all reasonable efforts to go ahead and make sure that the broadcasters were able to do that. It's certainly essential to the health of the broadcast industry, which, as Chairwoman Clyburn noted earlier, is another one of the key goals that we have here. So anything that I think falls within that category of what is reasonably necessary to provide the service to the communities that the broadcasters serve, I think is going to be essential. Now, I think everybody's going to take the right steps and look at. Sometimes there's going to have to be directionalized antennas. Sometimes there's going to have to be some other equipment that's in there. But if it's within the range of providing service to the community, it ought to be covered.
I want to pick up on something you said about a new kind of antenna. Mm-hmm. To what extent can broadband or master antenna systems help us minimize our costs, especially in shared facilities, also giving tower space considerations? And if you, maybe for our audience, if you want to just maybe give a few sentences on broadband and master antenna systems as opposed to individual antennas that people are using now.
Sure. There were a lot of lessons learned, I think, during the analog to digital broadcast transition that happened over the 10-year period of time. Broadband antennas at the beginning of the transition were not that widely accepted by TV station owners out there. Everybody wanted to continue on with their single frequency antennas. But as time went on, more and more as people got into the transition and recognized that broadband antennas could become a part of a plan and also provide some economic relief to the transition because that was money coming out of their pocket, relief that they could join forces with other stations in given markets, providing that those stations had same type of pattern, and an antenna could be designed, a broadband antenna or a master antenna could be designed to support multiple stations. It became a little bit more of a trend during the latter parts of the transition period, and antennas were built. From a tower standpoint, during this repack period, I feel will be essential at certain locations that TV stations get together and look at this as an option, not only to help out the FCC with the economics, but just because of physical space that could be available on structures out there, where say you have a candelabra configuration at the top where you have 3 antennas, 2 or 3 of those antennas are impacted by the repack. Does it make sense for all of those if they all have the same pattern to get together and all have the go together with one type of antenna? That means less transmission line on the tower. That probably means to a certain extent, even though a broadband antenna is heavier weight and wind load, by the time you get done adding up all of the weights and wind loads of the single antennas, that it could be the only solution on certain structures out there. And broadband antennas could come into play also as it relates to during the repack transition period where stations have to remain on the air while they're doing work on the top of the tower. If there's 3 or 4 stations on a tower, broadband antenna as an auxiliary or a temporary antenna will come into play also. So structurally, I feel that tower-wise that broadband antennas could definitely benefit not only from a cost standpoint, but also the time associated with the rollout and the physical space available at sites.
Just to follow up on what Pete said, I think the cost savings becomes when you get more than 2 stations trying to combine into an antenna. The difficulty with the broadband antennas have their place in the choices that are out there for broadcasters. All the stations have to have the same pattern because it's extremely difficult to create different patterns from the same antenna. You can do it, but it gets very complicated and very expensive. So all the stations in the market, that want to participate in the broadband, have to have the same azimuth pattern for coverage. You have to consider the transmission line sizes when you start combining more than 2 stations. You may need 2 transmission line runs, not a single run. You still have logistical issues in making the change. You still have to have the auxiliary facilities, the standby antennas, while you make the changes on the tower. They are difficult to customize. If 1 station or 2 wants to customize its pattern in a certain direction, that is difficult to do. All participants in the panel antenna have to agree to that. So the other thing you'll have to trade off is the wind load, as Pete had said. There may be wind load advantages to doing it versus a single stick type, single channel slot antenna versus going to a panel antenna as well. Then the other issue is the longer term reliability. They are more complex, and they're not inexpensive, and they are more complex. So the long term reliability of a panel antenna is not as good as a single channel antenna. However, given all those situations, there are certainly plenty of markets where that will be your only choice because of physical constraints, zoning constraints, tower constraints. So, but those situations will have to be evaluated and taken on a case-by-case basis.
Yes, of course.
Joe, how many markets are there where the patterns are going to be exactly? My understanding is there's not a lot.
Well, in the major markets, typically a lot of the stations will have omnidirectional antennas. I mean, there are situations where they're directional types, but in the larger markets, you'll find a lot of common, particularly omnidirectional. Mm-hmm. You get into the mid-size and smaller markets, or as stations came on the air later in time. Sure. They were more directionalized in nature, so combining them into an antenna is difficult. Now, you can do it. There may need to be some flexibility on the FCC for this to happen, so that if you have 3 stations in the market that have similar but all different antenna patterns, there may need to be some flexibility by the FCC to let all 3 come together on a common pattern that covers the majority of the market.
And I think then the concern from a broadcaster's perspective might be the coverage areas of the individual. Yes. I mean, somebody may be trying to serve a particular community, and that's something that we've also think that is a part of that equation to think about that. And
that's when the manufacturing community and the consulting community in Joe Davis and the FCC consultants and Pete and the structural people and the tower people get together and evaluate and jointly try to figure out what's the best alternative with the FCC's involvement.
Mm-hmm. But I think the point I was trying to add in there is that there's, I think in terms of the overall service to the public, which is one of the themes that we keep looking at, is trying to make sure that everybody's got the same pattern and coverage area may or may not be really consistent with what's in the public interest for the community.
This, oh yeah, please go ahead. Of course.
A related comment regarding that. Some of the times when we use these broadband master antennas for the first time, it involves stations moving to a new location where they have not historically broadcast from. And historically, there's been a lot of concern that stations need to or propose sites that shift their coverage areas. There's been a lot of concern about, well, what happens where coverage is lost, and is the coverage that's gained in the public interest? And some sort of flexibility or openness in looking at these matters should be on the table. And furthermore, going back to the original question about if you need additional equipment to serve what you had been serving, I'll point out a couple of scenarios there. Number one, there's a considerable number of stations who are supplementing their service and providing vital fill-in service with these replacement digital translators, which in turn may be displaced by the repacking activity. So if a station loses its replacement digital translator, is that going to be considered in other proposals or modifications to implement the repacked operation? And I'll also point out that there's a number of stations that presently enjoy and make good use of the vertical polarization component, and that's become more and more customary as stations build antennas. I'm concerned with the assignment of channel 14 because of the inherent issues with the first adjacent land mobile operations, which are vertically polarized. And the stations that may receive a channel 14 assignment will have great difficulty implementing vertical polarization. So, there's some very strange things that we need to consider when we talk about moving a station's coverage and from one channel to another. The options and opportunities may not exist on the new channel.
Understood. During the transition, some stations may need to build or rent interim facilities to broadcast their old channel while their new channel is being built. Can you talk about what this would entail for that interim period?
Well, I'll jump in with a few comments on that. Traditionally, you can think of a TV station with a big antenna on top of its tower and a transmitter that drives it. Some TV stations have an auxiliary antenna either on the same tower, side-mounted further down, or perhaps even at another site if they're very fortunate. But in most cases, there is no second antenna. So when we talk about moving to a new channel, we have the issue of, well, when we take the antenna off and put a new antenna up, there's a down period because it takes time to rig the tower and get the antenna off and back on. So it's customary to put up a side mount antenna during these construction projects, and the station can operate at reduced power, reduced operation, and maintain some amount of service. And the same sort of thing is going to need to be considered for this transition. An interim facility could operate either on the existing channel, or if coordinated properly, it can operate on the new channel while the top mount conversions are taking place. And the same is true for those stations even operating with a shared antenna, but lesser. They have transmitters that still need to be retuned. We discussed that already. But during the process of retuning, are we going to be off the air completely, or is there available some small transmitter that can plug in on the new or the old channel to carry the station through that period?
Just to follow up on what Joe was saying, very often manufacturers during a antenna changeout will provide loaner equipment for those purposes. And generally, most manufacturers on the antenna side have 2 or 3 sets of loaner equipment that they have in the field at any one time. So with the volume that we're going to see, loaner equipment that's loaned and then returned to the manufacturer to support the volume that we're looking at won't be available. So stations will have to purchase smaller antennas, perhaps a flexible run of transmission line, and perhaps even a small transmitter in order to get on the air. So that's part of the repacking process, so I would hope that the FCC considers that also in terms of its reimbursement costs.
Physical space at a site can also be an issue when it comes to transmitter buildings. Is there enough room physically on the ground to install a second set of transmitters, even on an interim basis? And also on the tower itself, what physical space is available? We all know that, people call broadcast towers, and wireless towers, but really a tower is a tower, and what hangs on the tower is really what makes a tower what it's called. But a large portion of side-mounted space on towers are used for other services out there. So is there physical space available? And then if we are hanging temporary equipment on the tower, then how will the structural engineer view that? Is it temporary on just for a week, a couple days, or if it's going to be up there for a longer period of time, then whatever structural analysis is done on a tower would have to consider that additional loading in the tower, and that will have to be addressed.
I think we do have to focus on the idea of making whatever those interim arrangements are as short in duration as possible, because it may involve some off-air time for the stations, and I know that's one of our big concerns is always trying to make sure that the service is going to be out there and available.
And on Bill's panel, after this one, we're going to go into that in a fair amount of detail.
And they may also involve additional structural costs, because that temporary equipment is going to add more load to the tower.
In the consideration of these interims in terms of how long they might operate, let's keep in mind that if the transition date is phased and you're relying on the guy in the next market to vacate a channel or for him to change a channel, then you may be on that interim antenna for a long time, or if weather conditions or just whatever the scenario is, the interim operation can be for a very extended amount of time in coordination of all these things. And the cost of implementing the interim facility is directly proportional to how much coverage is going to be achieved. If the interim is a short time, you can tolerate, a big reduction for a few days. That's one thing. If it's going to stretch out for 6 to 8 months, which is entirely possible, then you want that to be as robust as possible.
You mentioned a phased transition build, and there's been a lot of talk about that in the industry. And Jane, one of your early comments alluded to, and you all have actually alluded to, labor shortages, be they engineers or tower crews. We're all aware of these. And I guess the question is, in terms of coordinating or prioritizing the allocation of these limited services, is that something the FCC should do? Can we rely on industry to work cooperatively? Or where do you think, during this transition period, what do you think should be the FCC's role in helping to prioritize some of these scarce resources? Another surprise answer from Jane.
Actually, I'll take a stab at it. I mean, I think that it's going to be something that's going to be largely a matter of industry cooperation. I mean, I think we're going to be in a situation where if you try to have the government telling you where crews and things can go, that doesn't always make a lot of sense. So we had some lessons that were learned during the DTV transition of, you have groups that can kind of move from one place to another. You don't want them trying to go from East Coast to West Coast to try to make some changes. You certainly want to be in a position where you're dealing with the different issues that may be for a particular area, but you may also want to do it on a company basis. And I think those are the kinds of things that it's going to be uniquely in the hands of the broadcasters to say, okay, how can we do this best?
I think with respect to installation services, it's a very serious issue. There are probably 6 to 12 crews capable of handling the very large multi-ton antennas that might need to be moved. And it's going to depend on how the repacking is implemented, if it's phased or if it's by market size or if it's going to be a flip-the-switch type situation. It's going to be difficult to coordinate all that. Broadcasters, I know in the first phase, in the first transition, they certainly cooperated in various markets. I know in here in Washington, D.C., there was one crew that was working on 3 different sites and going from site to site to site, when they were held up by equipment perhaps for a day, they would jump in the cars and go to the other site and do work there. So the broadcasters cooperated pretty well. But it's a serious concern.
Going back to the analog to digital transition, if you think about it, it sort of was a free-form phased transition. You had PBS and some of the larger O&Os and groups out there being the first ones to step up and transition from analog to digital. Then you had more of the independents after that. So, we had this conversation back in 1996, 1997, were there going to be enough tower companies out there? Were there going to be enough crews to do that? Well, that sort of free-form phase transition, plus the fact that there was already in place the tower crews and antenna manufacturers and tower companies out there to handle that, and the fact that it was extended over a 10-year period of time, that sort of took care of all those issues. Here, where we're talking about a 3-year period, and we're talking about vendors that have sort of dwindled down to just a few tower manufacturers, structural engineers, tall tower crews, as Joe mentioned, that can do the heavy lifting. This will be a challenge over a shorter period of time, and a phased approach would definitely help. We all have to remember that safety is paramount. We all have to remember that this is a high-risk business, and that pressure should not be put on the industry to have these people go out there and feel that they have to be on the air by certain dates over a relatively short period of time. So again, just because of the attrition of the vendors associated with the tall tower and broadcast industry, the short period of time that we're talking about here, this really to me is sort of truly the bottleneck that can occur as we try to roll out and change as many antennas on these towers as we're talking about here in a short period of time.
I'll point out that we basically have 3 distinct phases to go through to execute all of this. The first phase would be planning before the first tower guy comes to the site. The broadcaster and the RF engineers and the structural engineers and the antenna manufacturers need to get together and decide exactly how they are going to implement this change, both for the final facility and the interim facility. So that's a big bunch of work all at first. The second phase goes into the equipment acquisition, where we've decided what we're going to do. Let's order everything we need. Then Joe Zuba gets really, really busy over there with orders, and the transmitter manufacturers start to build transmitters and cut metal. And then the third phase becomes the implementation, when the stuff arrives and is on site and the towers become modified and the riggers go up to hoist new antennas. So we have 3 distinct phases, and each one of them has its own set of bottlenecks.
That's a really good point, because I think it does, back to my broken record part here, the earlier we know what channels the stations are going to, that planning can happen, and the better off that it's going to be, and the maximum amount of time that you can get to be able to go through each of those phases, I think is going to be essential.
I was going to shift gears, but I want to ask this question that we got from our online someone in our online audience, because it's relevant to this. What is the impact on stations operating on common broadband antennas that are not required to move channels, but other stations on the antenna are required to move? Should they also be compensated?
Yeah, we had discussed that earlier about sort of the collateral impact that will occur to stations that aren't part of the repack. Perfect example is where you have a cantilever tower with stacked antennas, and the top antenna is affected by the repack, goes to a lower channel, same gain antenna, heavier antenna, but the lower antenna of the station that's unaffected by the repack, modifications or even possibly that antenna may have to be changed out. If they're part of if the tower can only handle, say, a broadband antenna, and there's a station on a tower that's not part of the repack, but in order to repack the other channels, there's a broadband antenna that's needed. That that unaffected station may have to come over and join. Who's going to pay for their filters, combiners, things like that? So when it gets into sort of the multiple antenna tall towers out there, that's really where you're going to see the greatest probability of sort of some collateral work that would have to be done with other stations.
And we talked about this a little bit last year, but it's also that it's not even just another television station, but can be other occupants on the tower that may be, wireless facilities. It could be radio stations. It could be a lot of different folks that are occupying the same tower that could be affected here. And I think all of those really need to be included in the potential costs.
Yeah, they all may need temporary facilities while the changes up top are being made.
So what you're hearing is, yes, they will be affected. How the money flows,
and they should be reimbursed.
How the money flows needs to be sorted out, but they will certainly be affected and have expenses.
Yeah, well, that's what we're trying to sort out. Obviously, there are a lot of unknowns with respect to this transition, and one which many people feel might be a long pole in the tent is zoning and permitting. It's a cost that's hard to estimate. It's a timing issue that's very hard to estimate. So we're wondering, do you think there's anything that the FCC could do to facilitate zoning and permitting on towers whose changes require that? We did something that potentially could be similar with respect to our shot clock order for the wireless industry. So do you think there's anything that we could do that would compress that time to help us with the 3-year window here?
We think it's a good idea to try.
Okay.
We think it's going to be a very good idea to try to have some sort of process for keeping this moving, whether it can be done exactly as it was with regard to the shot clock that went before, because I think it's a different statutory requirement. But you are likely to run into zoning and permitting issues. You also have to think about, I think the original shot clock that you had before was 90 days for the first application, 150 to get to all of the applications, and I'm not entirely certain that that's going to put us in a good spot with our 3 years. But certainly the idea of trying, I think, is something that's a very good one.
I've appeared at zoning hearings, and I will tell you that broadcasters have long coveted the concept that the wireless providers have, where the local jurisdiction cannot consider the issue of RF exposure, provided that it meets the federal standard. It's just off the table and can't be considered. That doesn't apply to broadcasters, and there's a lot of hue and cry from the whole process regarding RF exposure. So perhaps some effort there, or at least some education, might be in order. And I do know that it's a very nice booklet came out in 2000, the Local Government Officials Guide to Transmitter Antenna, blah, 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 RF safety. I understand that's being revised under the RF exposure NPRM that's currently out. but some consideration to how tall towers and the TV repacking could be helped to expedite in that. Obviously, the tall towers have the antennas well elevated. There's very little issue with RF exposure down at the ground.
Peter, you've mentioned certain tower upgrades in different scenarios, but there's this underlying, I think we're going to start to hear about Revision G more as we go further. Would you just give a summary of what Rev G is and how we should anticipate what, if any, Rev G revisions are going to be brought into this process?
Absolutely. Back in the late 40s, the Telecommunications Industry Association set standards for antenna support structures. And there are standards out there. You may hear them called EIA 222 or TIA or ANSI, TIA, EIA. And it's a set of standards that were established for, back then, for broadcast towers. So the beginning of VHF towers being built, and then followed by a lot of towers that supported UHF. During the period that the standards, since the standards have been in effect, there have been a number of revisions over the years. And up until 1987, the revisions weren't that substantial. From the original standard to their revision C, the towers were designed for a uniform wind pressure, pounds per square foot wind pressure load, and there was never a standard or a mandatory standard for ice loading back then. It was really up to the purchaser if they wanted to add ice to their tower load or not. And during this period, from 49 to 87, the majority of the tall towers, UHF, VHF, and UHF towers, were built. Since 1987, the EIA standard went to a basic wind speeds through a D, E, and F revisions, and it took time. Remember, these are standards; these are not codes. So the standard had to be then established nationwide and had to be adopted by state and local municipalities, which took time. So there's a period of time where a local or state municipality may require that a tower be built under Revision C, even though the standard for Revision F was out. So during the transition from analog to digital through the 2000s, the EIA, TIA standard again was changed. A new revision came out, which was Revision G, came out in 2006. Totally different way of designing towers. Required what's called a 3-second gust response factor, which was more in line with the Uniform Building Code and international building codes out there. And also, there's now a mandatory, Revision G requires mandatory ice loading in certain areas. And also, geography and topography plays a big role in designing towers these days. Obviously, coastal towers being subject to higher wind speed areas than ever before. Mountaintop sites subjected to what's called speed-up effect, where wind comes up the mountain. So a lot of mountaintop towers that were never designed for speed-up effect or designed for ice loading are now subject to ice loading. And the way G is written is that basically any tower that's analyzed today that exceeds its original designed loading standard will then have to be designed under Revision G. Now, you may say, well, that came out in 2006, so maybe some towers during the analog to digital transition were impacted by that. But by the time the standard was published and by the time the standard made its way to state and local municipalities, it was sort of graduated into place. And the majority of the analog and digital TV towers that were built during the transition, most of those were built prior to 2006 or just after. So most of those towers were built to Revision F. So now you have a new set of standards that you have to take into account. Since we're dealing with the channel repack, and Joe had brought up that to go to a lower channel, maintain same pattern, maintain same gain of antenna, that will require typically a larger larger antenna. So revision G will impact the repack and require, in some cases, a little modification in lower wind speed areas, but as you get closer to all these other conditions out there, will require substantial modification, and in some cases, towers will have to be replaced.
I think the money question, though, is how many towers are estimated not to meet Rev G. And that number is not known until you study it. You just don't know. Some anecdotal information, treat it such as it may be treated, is in the ballpark of maybe 30% of the towers would meet Rev G without any further reinforcing. Is that consistent with anything you might have heard, Pete?
Yeah, that's probably a little bit on the low side.
Okay.
Some of what has been good is on the wireless side of the business. There's been a lot of work going on, obviously, with wireless companies upgrading their systems from 2G to 3G to 4G, which requires more equipment. Those broadcast towers that have seen some of this additional work in recent years. The requirement there, again, falls under Rev G, so those towers have been brought up to Revision G. Really, the major impact is going to be on broadcast towers that really have not been touched for quite a while. So we'll have impact. Again, the percentages is up in the air, but 30%, I've heard up to maybe 50 to 60% of the towers will need some type of Rev G upgrade.
And will sorry, Joe, did you have something?
And all that factors into the timing as well, because you have to go through the structural analysis. That takes time. And then if you have to do a structural analysis, you have to do that work before you change your antennas and lines and anything on the tower. So you have to factor that into the timeline of the whole project.
And does it matter to the timing or possibly the cost if the tower is leased versus owned? Is there any advantage to one or the other with respect to getting any Rev G modifications done quickly?
Well, if a station is leasing a tower, it adds an additional element, and that additional element, of course, is the contractual obligation or the lease between the lessee, the station, and the lessor, the tower owner. So, the leases will have to be reviewed, and a discussion will have to occur on what impact a TV station could possibly have on the tower infrastructure. If you're adding load to the tower, the station will have to work with the tower owner. If there are multiple TV stations that are impacted by the repack, then it makes sense for the tower owner to get all the stations together as a group and determine best way to meet deadlines, and also look at the economic factors and pattern and coverage and what type of antenna makes sense for everybody to get together. So really, the additional element, if you're leasing a tower, is the fact that you have a contractual document that you would have to address with the tower owner. It can be a benefit in that you do hopefully have a professional company operating that tower, and they have team and staff in place that have gone through this before and know what to do, as in zoning and permitting, what regulatory approvals are required. So they could handle what staffing up would be required or what consulting engineers would have to be hired in order to do that. Where if you own your own tower, then you can. One other thing about leasing space is if you're a station leasing space from another broadcaster, you have to then determine, again, what your sort of contractual obligation is with that other broadcaster. That other broadcaster owns that tower. They may have first right to do anything on that tower, so if they're affected by the repack, that could come into play. If you own your own tower, then it's really up to you to go out and hire the proper regulatory consultants, structural engineering consultants, find out exactly where you stand with your structure, and then look at the implementation time associated with changing out your antenna and any other site changes you have to make.
Okay, let me take a break and see if there's anyone in the audience who has a question. Oh, yeah, please come up to the mic. Thanks, Mark.
Hi, Mark Aiken, Sinclair Broadcast Group. It's really an observation. One of the things that's concerning me in this whole discussion is that everything seems to be phrased around notions of the only choice might be, lots of ifs. Does something fit? And it's been the history of the broadcast industry to engineer the most robust infrastructure possible. It seems to me that the biggest variable that stands in the way of allowing that to happen is the time frame. And quite frankly, sometimes bad laws are written because people don't know what they don't know. So the 3-year time frame that's been imposed on the reimbursement of costs seems to be driving a suboptimal choice being made by broadcasters to meet an artificial constraint, which I believe there's a responsibility, if not on the part of the FCC, on the part of somebody to go back to Congress and rewrite the law and allow more than 3 years so that the right job can be done within the constraints of an open market as opposed to, again, a government-mandated push to meet an objective that at the end of the day does not provide the American consumer, the American viewer, with anything but a suboptimal service. This should be an opportunity to make broadcasting a more optimal service in today's environment. And what I'm hearing today leads me all the further to believe all the more reason to forego any reimbursement and elect flexible use as the way to move forward.
Comments, reactions?
Just a quick reaction, which is that obviously what we've heard today are the challenges. I was heartened with Chairwoman Clyburn's comment about the industry and the dedication to be able to go forward, and I think that is an important element, and I think we should be considering whether ultimately, if we need more time, that there should be the ability to try to have that happen.
I've been to a number of these Learn conferences. I have to say this is absolutely one of the best panels I have been able to witness. I really do appreciate the knowledge that's contained here and the
these guys.
Very, very, well, Jane, as you said, I knew what you were going to say. But excellent, everybody. Thank you very much. Most definitely worth being here. And I traveled a ways to get here, so thank you for making it worth my time. Pursuant to Jane's comment, broadcasters needing to know as soon as possible what channels they're being moved to. It goes to all the points about the complexities that exist here, and you have illuminated them all just beautifully today. A, when are we going to know this? And B, does the FCC even have the data? I mean, at this point, whether we have a 3-year shot clock or anything, is it something that folks, any of you really have an idea? Does anybody from the FCC have an idea when we might know what those channels are so we could start doing all the important things that you've talked about?
Well, as you know, the auction is a voluntary auction. It relies on voluntary participation by the broadcasters as to whether or not they want to go off the air and contribute their channel or channel share or move to VHF. And because it's voluntary in nature, it's very difficult, in fact impossible, for us to know now who might be volunteering to either exit the business or move. What this auction is trying to do is match supply from the broadcaster side with demand from the wireless side. And that is going to be a dynamic process that really happens at the time of the auction. So what we're trying to do in fora like this is to do as much planning that we can up front so that we're ready when we do know how many people are moving, what the new band plan is going to look like. We're as ready as possible.
And being
to
a
hit the ground
broadcaster,
running.
I can tell you that that's a laudable concept and a wonderful idea. But in practice, you're going to keep hearing, as I do, the same thing every time, which is until we know what it is, we can only speculate about planning for it. And when we can only speculate about planning for it, we can't really put numbers into it. And when the numbers can't be put into it, we don't know whether or not any of it's going to work. But I appreciate your answer. I have one other question. Given a 3-year requirement to trigger the funds, and assuming that those of us who have actually been broadcasters for multiple decades or serviced the industry understand that it's not something you can set up and say get her done. 3 years is a very short period of time. It took us a long time for the last digital transition. If one assumes that we have an auction next year, which I hope we do, and some clock starts for reimbursement, isn't it possible, and I'm asking the panel here, isn't it possible that with the march of technology, even ATSC 3.0, which is it envisions many new and wonderful things to make broadcasting more relevant in the daily lives of average Americans, a critical component, in my opinion, what if these expenses roll into a point where ATSC does adopt 3.0? What if we have a next generation standard? I'd be interested in the panel's opinion for the benefit of all here. What would we do with that? We're talking about the potential of having totally different transmission infrastructure where we may balance an SFN ahead of a single stick in that new transmission infrastructure. That's more sites, but it might be better for the public. We might be talking about different hardware or more expensive hardware that anticipates being able to do that next generation standard. How would you all say those kinds of expenses and pre-planning should be addressed, and should they be eligible even if they're cutting edge? Thank you again.
We kind of talked about that ourselves as to what can be expected to be reimbursed, adding vertical component, so to speak, or some other technology that we may be working on behind the scenes or other people are working on behind the scenes. How that gets incorporated into the reimbursement process, I'm not certain, and if it happens in the middle of the reimbursement process, broadcasters may say, well, I've changed my mind, I want to do something else now. Do you get a chance to reapply and do something else?
But the point is really well taken, that one of the things that we ought to be thinking about as we're going through this entire process is one where you say, okay, you don't try to set yourself in stone at one particular point in time, that you have to have some flexibility as you're going forward, and if there is a better way to do it, and perhaps there may be, equipment, something changes that makes it better to do, that I would hope that the reimbursement fund would be open to figuring out, okay, is this better overall in the public interest, to look at it from that perspective.
Lana?
Thank you. Lana Thompson with Public Television. This panel's been really helpful, and I just want to address one of the questions that keeps me awake at night, which is the eligible expenses versus the amount of the reimbursement fund. And I know this is all subject to, we don't know, and how many stations will need to be repacked. But I found in listening to this panel, which was really, really helpful, some really new pieces of the puzzle that I was not aware of in terms of the reimbursement and what probably should be eligible expenses. And I have to commend NAB and Jane Magel and her team for pulling together the broadcasters around the expenses that we all feel should be eligible. And as public television stations, we have some unique expenses, for example, grant-related costs, which the NAB included in their list. And many people may be surprised by finding out that if our stations have to relocate and abandon, so to speak, equipment, they need to pay back the remaining costs of that equipment over that period of time to the funders, CPB, NTIA, RUS, Department of Agriculture, other funders. That's a really unique expense that many people probably aren't aware of. So my question is, having heard other unique expenses I've learned about, to the panel, what's your sense about eligible expenses that absolutely should be included versus the amount of the repacking fund, the $1.75 billion, and where are we going to end up at the end of the day?
The position that we've taken, as you know, I think is that we ought to try to treat the $1.75 billion as the budget here and see if there isn't some way that we actually engineer looking at how many changes have to be made and minimize those changes in some way to make sure that we're able to cover all these costs. And that's precisely why this is a terrific panel today to help to identify some of those other costs that we haven't been talking about. And I commend the FCC for bringing us together to talk about that. I think it's important. And the public notice that just went out that has lists of things I think are going to be very interesting for us to focus on and look at as well. But again, our position is that we should treat this as this is what we've got.
Thank
Hi, I'm Mike Gravino with the Low Power TV Spectrum Rights Coalition. This panel scares me. All 6,400 of us in the low power service, we're not eligible for repacking relocation costs. And everything you're saying about a 3-year time frame possibly turning into a much longer time frame, and antennas below the big antennas getting affected and moved around. Well, our industry has suffered under not being eligible for the auction for the last 2 years. If we have another year to go before the auction, and then 3 years plus another 4 years maybe after that, and then we do our repack, we've got a 7 possible year dislocation of our industry. We represent 74% of all broadcast licenses. So when you all talk about broadcasters, remember 74% are the small guys, and we cover most of the market as well as you do. So anything you do here affects us greatly and our constituents and our members. One quick point, there's over 60 low powers that are network affiliates. They're not eligible for relocation funds. You're going to have to figure out how to deal with them. You have all the translators that are network affiliates. You're going to have to figure out how to deal with them. So while you're doing this, please don't forget the majority of the broadcasters are the small guys. Thank you.
I have a comment regarding the low powers and the translators. And of course, we're not in charge of what the expenses that qualify for reimbursement, but I agree with what you're saying in terms of you're out there. And I also know that the drain on the industry is not just going to be for those stations that are taking the reimbursement. There will be stations who are taking auction proceeds to go from UHF to VHF, for instance. They too will be draining tower crews and consultants and equipment suppliers. And the low power TV transition, which is in process, is also draining those same resources. And as soon as the repacking results are available and we know what channels will be left at the end of the day, there's certainly going to be a drain amongst those low power stations seeking to find a vacant channel where they can live. So,
right. If I may just make one quick point, there's over 2,000 construction permits in the low power sector from the ADD conversion and the 2009 filing window that still have to be completed, and we may be forced to double build and then have to rebuild very quickly to be back in service.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep.
And we have time for one last question before we break.
Hi, I'm Joe Chidelli from Sennheiser, and I beseech the Commission to comprehend the magnitude of the adverse impact the repacking will have on wireless microphones operating in the 600 megahertz band. Many of them were just purchased a few years ago when 700 megahertz equipment was obsoleted as a result of the last auction. Broadcasters, whether they're moving their channels or not, will incur expenses for new hardware, as well as frequency coordination and configuration services. These should be factored into the reimbursement process. Furthermore, this issue also impacts all live entertainment, sporting events, as well as government facilities, schools, and houses of worship. I highly suggest the Commission opens a dialogue with mic manufacturers on a program such as a voucher program similar to the analog TV set-top boxes to dampen the inevitable outcry of non-broadcasters whose 600 megahertz equipment was purchased within the past few years to replace their original 700 megahertz equipment. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we are developing a record on all these issues, and I appreciate your input. And with that, you were promised a break. It's a few minutes late, but I think we can take 10 minutes and reconvene right at around 11:30 for our broadcaster coordination panel. Thank you. And thank our panelists, too. It was a great job.
Hello, folks. If you'll take your seats, please, we'll get started on the second panel. To start just with a reminder that we will take questions at the end. I will just invite people to come up to the microphone with their questions after our panel discussion is completed. And if any members of the web audience would like to submit questions, they can send them to our email address, livequestions@fcc.gov. We're now going to shift focus a bit to focus on opportunities for cooperation and collaboration among broadcasters and between the industry and the Commission to try to address some of the constraints that we have, both in terms of timing and in terms of expense of the repack, and other ideas we have for mitigation of expenses generally. And we have a very qualified group of panelists to address those questions. Starting with Mark Aitken, Vice President for Advanced Technology at Sinclair Broadcast Group. Mark has been with Sinclair almost 15 years, focusing on advanced technology issues, including the next generation broadcast standard. And he represents Sinclair in numerous industry organizations, including as chairman of the ATSC's mobile standardization activity. David Donovan, president of the New York State Broadcasters Association, is well known to us here in Washington. He's a broadcast industry veteran, having spent over 25 years in TV. And he was most recently president of the Association for Maximum Service Television, where he helped guide the industry through the digital transition. Robert Kelly, partner at Squire Sanders. Bob leads the firm's communications practice group, and since 2004, he has served as the general counsel of the 800 megahertz transition administrator, which was appointed by the FCC to administer the reconfiguration of the 800 megahertz band. And last but not least, Lana Thompson, Executive Vice President and COO of APTS. Lana has been with the Association of Public Television Stations for 17 years and oversees the operations and legal affairs of APTS, including representing member stations' interests in regulatory proceedings. Before joining APTS, she was a communications lawyer in private practice for 10 years. Aaron Dozier of NAB has been unable to be with us this morning. I'll start with a question that picks up on the many references we heard in the first panel to the digital TV transition. That's a recent memory. We hope to learn lessons from that, both what to do and what not to do. And in light of the focus of this panel, I'll just ask any of the panelists whether there are lessons we can learn there, both of successes or failures, in the ways in which broadcasters coordinated then to achieve that transition. David.
The answer is yes. I think one of the things you have to look at as you're going through the transition of television is it's not just television. I mean, what you're really changing is an entire communications system. And that includes a number of elements, not only the path that sends a signal to the home, but a variety of other aspects in terms of studio transmitter leaks. It's the entire environment that you have to look at. And I think if there's one thing that we learned from the digital transition is that coordination and planning and taking the time to do it is absolutely essential. And I think one of the problems that we have here, and we saw was certainly articulated in the first panel, is you have 3 years to do this, which is a far shorter time than we had with respect to the last time around. The coordination, I think, is important. You know, frankly, we're looking at OTA viewers in this country, and I know in upstate New York, or in New York, just for example, there are 640,000 viewers in New York City alone that rely exclusively on over-the-air television, and they're the country's most vulnerable people in many respects. So we have to be exceedingly careful. Coordination. There are some lessons I think that we learned. One is to look at the translators, which I think weren't focused on initially in the DTV transition, but became vitally important towards the end, particularly in getting signals out, not only to regional areas, but to communities, for example, in New York City, for example. The second thing is the ability to coordinate with the engineering community. We didn't coordinate in a specific sense on equipment purchasing or things of that nature, frankly, because of the antitrust laws, and I think that there are some issues there. But we were able to coordinate, I think, particularly on an ad hoc basis on the engineering side. Let me just highlight a couple of other things. The other thing that you have to also coordinate with is one of the things we ran into, particularly when we talked about tower crews and equipment folks. We also were going through an ENG transition at the time. And surprise, surprise, history is repeating itself. We're also looking at a potential shift in ENG spectrum during this transition as well. So I think there may be some issues that we'll have to deal with coordination there. The other things that worked fairly well, one of the things is our ability, and we'll talk about this more, to coordinate with both cable and satellite entities. That was absolutely critical. The other lesson I think that we learned is the ability to let the market work, and in particular, post-transition, the ability to work through negotiated interference arrangements, which allowed stations to maximize and also work out market-based solutions. I thought that was extremely important. The other thing, and it's so simple, but it really is important, was our ability to coordinate with the FCC. Last time around, and my hat's off to the Video Services Division and to Barbara Kreisman and to your team, Bill, they were absolutely phenomenal in the ability to process and get this work done. So I think that there are some lessons learned. I think the one thing that is of concern, and I'm sure we will get into it now in terms of lessons learned, is the fundamental lesson was we knew it was coming. We knew what we had to do. I'm not so sure we have that this time around. And to no surprise, I'm very concerned with the ability to coordinate with stations, particularly with respect to upstate New York. Because until we resolve the Canadian issues, I won't know, if I'm a station, how I'm going to cut my antenna. It boils down to those basic issues. So that's sort of an overview. I think there were some lessons learned, but plan, and more planning.
It is inherent, of course, in this process that there are unknowns because we're going into a voluntary auction that we didn't have last time around, which is one of the reasons that we held our first workshop on this subject a year ago, and we're holding this one now, to try to plan as much as we can before we know which stations will be moved in order to be as efficient as we can later.
If I could add to that point, I mean, the planning is essential, and knowing the frequencies you're going to is essential, but what we also learned in the past is that it was incredibly difficult, even with an additional channel being allocated to broadcaster, and even in an environment where there was simulcasts going on, and even in an environment where discussions had been going on in the industry. I think of the caucuses, for example, where sections of the country met on a consistent basis, and they sort of weighed the activities that were underway, and at the same time, there was a fundamental shift. Some of this planning started long before there was even a standard established to move into. So I think that not only is this cooperation amongst broadcasters important, I think it is going on, but I would also say that I believe the FCC probably could be more engaged in some of these industry activities and might have another notion of what's going on if they participated more openly in some of the industry activities. I mean, events like this are great, but when you need $1 and someone hands you 10 cents, you got to do it 10 times. So involvement in activities such as the ATSC standard setting process, you may find that there's a lot to be. I know that we differ on this notion of will ATSC 3.0 happen in time for a transition, but I'm optimistic because I'm on the inside and shaping that discussion, and I think FCC ought to be at that same table to at least understand where the industry is going.
We're certainly very interested in all the information we can get about that process. Mark,
Bill,
you mentioned companion channels.
Oh, I'm sorry. May I just follow up quickly on a point that Dave Donovan made on the translators? And I know I've made you and the rest of your staff very aware of our concern about translators, but I do think I'd like to make a point that actually addresses your question about coordination. In the state of Utah, over 20% of the population, the households, are served by translators. And to their credit, the Utah broadcasters, commercial and non-commercial, have come together and figured out a statewide plan on how to work through with translators in the repacking. We have two problems there. One is the big cost of the repacking fund and that not covering translators. But the second piece of it, which I think is within the FCC's control, is the exact point Dave made, which is making sure that translators are included in the repacking process, recognizing their secondary. But ideally, what we've asked for is that translators that are in rural areas remain allowed to remain in operation until and if those successful wireless bidders bid out in those areas. The alternative would be, if the translators have to move, that not be done after the entire repacking process, so that translator licensees have to seek new channels and go through the whole concept again, but that it could be done seamlessly during the repacking and kept in mind. So I think that's an excellent point, and I just have to reiterate that because we have, you've heard these statistics before, but half of our households that receive public television in New Mexico receive it by translators.
Thank you.
Can I just add on to that? Because translators up to now, there's always been a discussion about them being in the West, and that's a huge issue in the West. But let me just give you a real-world example as how it also can affect your planning for costs. Mountain Lakes Public Broadcasting out of Plattsburgh covers, obviously, the Plattsburgh-Burlington market, but they use 4 translators to get their signal through the entire Adirondacks. And that area is actually the largest park in the United States. Yosemite can fit within the Adirondacks. If translators, particularly on the East Coast for spectrum concerns, aren't, assuming they're not protected, and they get squeezed out, there is going to be a cost factor as to how you get Mountain Lakes Public Broadcasting signal through its entire market and through the Adirondacks. And indeed, at least in one instance, the translator is used to get a signal to a cable head-end. So if the translator option is lost, then the next question becomes, as part of the transition, should the government cover the costs, for example, of either getting a separate microwave line or a fiber feed to these vastly remote areas? And that's not out west, that's in New York. And the flip side is in New York City, where CBS has a filler translator. And that filler translator was necessary because of interference coming in from another market. So if you lose that translator, what do you do to get signals to, it really is almost like a little hole in Long Island that has to be dealt with. So it affects the cost function as well in terms of reimbursement. And I think that's important to consider.
Thank you. I think, Mark, you mentioned that in the DTV transition we had companion channels. So there were people were broadcasting on their new frequency with their new digital facility while they still had the analog facility on. We won't have companion channels here. What are the implications of that?
Well, I think that we heard a lot of them. Planning is fine, but the implementation is a question of I know very specific examples of having to upgrade from F to G. The notion of having to put a standby antenna on to be able to take that full power to a temporary location so that a new full power antenna can be put in place could impact the job by not just a matter of dollars, it's a matter of time frame. Because when you look across a scattering of 100 plus stations on our part, we can show you 24 examples where there's a major cost impact in being able to transition on the same channel, because it requires really almost 2 completely separate facilities. The notion was introduced of can't remember the phrase you used, but a host station, right? One of these stations that are, that are being peeled off as a function of the auction. Well, it's a nice idea, but if it's in a location that doesn't adequately serve the population, It's an idea that that's stillborn. So at the end of the day, until we know the real channels that people are going to occupy and be moved into, we can do a lot of hocus pocus around what ifs, but my sense is that 3 years is not enough to get this job done. It's a minimum of a 5 to 6 year transition, and we need to be planning for that now as opposed to simply standing around and thinking that things somehow magically are going to happen in 3 years.
I think the effect of the lack of a companion channel is that it increases the risk significantly that there will be times and periods when service, over-the-air service, may very well be cut off for a period of time. And what scares me about that and why the lack of a companion channel, I think, raises some issues. We talked about equipment. We talked about the shortage of tower crews in this country. There is also, when we learned about this when we were doing the BAS clearing, it's the ability to integrate all that and to get all that done at the same time. Now, I think it was at the last panel, I think it was Jay Adrick indicated there's only 14 tall tower crews in this country. There is a shortage. But in addition to that, I think one of the things that we've learned from others is that there's always this sense that if the government creates a mandate, the market will automatically respond. And while that is true, what we learned in the BAS aspect of it, if you have a fairly short period of time, employment may or may not increase. The equipment market may very well not come out and meet your demand. The service market, in terms of either tall tower crews or other systems integrators, they may not add on other people. Your zoning issues, and I think this is often lost, because way back when in a prior life I was actually a real estate lawyer and litigated. And one of the things that people think, well, I'll only have to deal with the zoning issue if I'm in fact building another tower. Well, that's not necessarily true. What we found out the last time is all you need to do, for example, is do a side mount. And depending on how those local zoning rules are drafted, you now have a change in use, which brings you before the city or town council. So you start adding up all those things, and the lack of a companion channel, I think, dramatically changes the equation, because you may have, for significant periods of time, folks who may very well lose service.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of examples of 2 years in getting through the federal, state, or local agencies, the permitting process. So some way to preempt that will be absolutely essential if there's going to be anything less than a 5-year time frame involved here.
Right. Mark took the words right out of my mouth. If you really want to expedite this process, the federal government right now should start working on legislation or policies that essentially, for the time being, for this project, preempt local and state zoning laws. Because unless you do full bore preemption, you're going to run into some issues. And you're not going to get it done in 3 years.
As we attack the issue of keeping broadcasters on the air during the transition, we've heard a fair amount about the pluses and minuses of side mount antennas as temporary facilities. And Mark, you mentioned one of the issues we've been thinking about is whether there will be stations in at least most major markets that are going dark voluntarily because they've decided to do that in the auction. They will have facilities and a channel that will be no longer used as soon as they go dark. Those facilities will be tuned to the channel they were using, and one thing we've been exploring is whether those facilities and the channel could be used as sort of temporary staging facilities for a station that's being repacked. And I know there will be both practical and maybe some legal or contractual issues that will present, but are there circumstances in which you think this is possibly helpful and something we should continue to explore?
I'll start, Bill, with that, and I think it's an issue that should be explored, and that may be a necessary solution depending on the amount of time that a station may be off the air. Dave and Mark addressed that. Obviously, even a minute or an hour is too long to be off the air. for broadcast stations. So if that's the alternative to an extended time off the air, I do think it's worth exploring. Our only concerns thinking through that are what are the costs and how would that impact the reimbursement fund allotment, and would it sidetrack the 3-year time frame? I mean, we certainly are very cognizant that that's a very quick time frame and we want to stay within that. And I think the last issue is consumers and any consumer education is, will it be more difficult for consumers to understand their station is moving and then moving again? So, as you said, those are all the practical considerations, but I do think the issue should be explored because the alternative being off the air is not a good alternative.
The thought just occurred to me that when you think about moving from a high channel to a low channel, you are almost guaranteed to exceed the current loading factor on the tower by the very fact that you're operating at a lower frequency than a higher frequency. So if you take a channel 45 antenna with a known pattern and you move it down to channel 25, by definition, it's going to be taller, it's going to be bigger around. And if you decide to better serve your population and elect for heavy null fill, for example, you may add a requisite number of additional slots because you're now depressing power down in order to achieve your horizon coverage. And suddenly what you've done is that you almost have guaranteed a 25 or 30% wind load addition to that tower just by moving the frequency and keeping the same coverage. And that's going to be replicated across the country on a sweeping basis. So if you want something to happen, you should be engaged in the industries that are most crucial in making that happen need to stay alive. Here's an indication. Here's a auction on the premises of Stainless LLC. They are shutting down. They have a complete tall tower manufacturing facility that is now at auction. So if we don't provide some surety, if we don't end the questions that surround this, I don't know if you're going to have anybody left to fill the demands of broadcasters when the time arrives.
Let me just add to what Mark and Lana said. I think, first of all, I compliment you folks for trying to think outside the box. And I don't think that there is going to be, whether it's a side mount issue, whether it's using a staged channel, I think, or a temporary channel, I don't think there's any one sort of magic bullet here. This is going to depend on market to market. And so I would encourage you to explore and provide as many options as possible for stations during this transition. And I think that's a good thing. I think one of the concerns I have in relying on sort of a staging channel where someone in the market has decided to exit and can another station move into that station. Not all facilities are created equal. And generally, those who may be wanting to exit the business, it's entirely possible they may not have made investments in equipment for several years. So if I'm a full bore, want to serve my community, and the only option available is a quote staging channel which has half the coverage area, has a transmitter that's on its last legs, that may or may not be a good option for me. Indeed, it may cost me more to try to bring that up to snuff. Now, if I don't, I'm left with a scenario where the coverage that I used to have during the interim, I may not have now. My ability to get signals to a cable head end. And after the digital transition, there was an increase in cable systems using the off-air portion to get to their head end. May very well change. Not to mention that a number of folks who were in my community will no longer get me during the interim. So it may be a solution of last resort, but it may or may not be a good one. And then if you go to side mounts, you have all the antenna issues that I think Mark has raised in terms of loading and things of that.
Well, I think it comes back to, our organization prides itself on its ability to engineer. And as an industry, I think that we've proven time and time again that in the face of major disasters, it's broadcast television that continues to shine through. So a staging facility that doesn't, for example, have standby generation capacity, you'd almost have to knock that off the list, because we don't know when a hurricane, tornado, whatever is going to happen. And again, I think that would be a suboptimal choice, and certainly would not be to the benefit of the American public.
As we try to explore all the options, one question that's recurred to us with respect to the possibility of staging channels is, I guess, a contractual one. Broadcaster's just decided to go out of business. He may be leasing space on a tower from a company that owns the tower. I don't think that broadcaster is going to want to stay as a lessee on that facility. Is it feasible to have the contractual relationship assumed by another broadcaster, so that you don't have a situation where a broadcaster says, I want to liquidate my lease, I don't want to stay in the business for another year?
I drafted commercial real estate arrangements for a long time, including leases, and everything I did for a long time was non-assignable, particularly in an environment that involves transmitters and RF and a lot of, I mean, if I own a tower and I have multiple stations on that tower, including television and radio, I want to make sure I have a good citizen. And so the question is whether or not, as a general rule, these leases are readily assignable. I don't know the answer to that. I think it really is going to depend. And if it is assignable and I own the tower and I'm someone else, do I increase the price for a certain period of time? I mean, there's a host of little legal issues that have to be borne out there.
Well, there's certainly an assignable cost to that
Yes.
move in that facility, and how does that get worked in?
I have a question from the diaspora, and it's somewhat related to this. As we've been considering the repacking of stations, our lodestar has been that we won't involuntarily move a station to a different location. There may be some locational moves in connection with channel sharing that are voluntary, but we've been thinking basically of keeping a station where it is geographically and matching its existing coverage. Should we consider geographic moves as a way to either produce a more efficient repack or to minimize expenses of the repack?
No.
I think you're raising some real. Lon, I'm sorry.
No, I'm just shaking my head no with Mark.
I think the answer is no, and I think if you go down that road, you're raising some very, very interesting issues. Broadcast television stations were allocated on a local basis. In order to make this work, if I start pulling stations out of Buffalo to give them to Rochester, I think the members of Congress in this community that's losing stations may have something to say about that, because you are affecting the diversity and the dynamics of particular markets. And from a broadcaster's perspective, after building audiences for 50, 60 years, to suddenly say, oops, I'm going to, not voluntarily, but I am now going to force you to move to another community, I think is, I think it's beyond the pale. So,
yeah, and I would say that if a broadcaster elected to move to better serve the public, then it might better serve your transition. Right. So a no is not always a no, but first and foremost, the question has to be asked: how is this going to impact the American public?
Right.
And so the answer is no. If it flies in the face of a statement I heard earlier, this auction is to ensure the healthy future of broadcasting.
Bob, we can't let you get off too easily here. One of the things that was discussed in the first panel was the possibility of seeing greater use of broadband or master antennas in the connection with the repack and in the future of broadcasting. Is there something that the Commission should do to either encourage that or even require it in certain circumstances?
So what we've had in the 800 transition is a lot of licensees in different circumstances who experienced, I think, some of the issues that were referred to in the first panel about technology changing and a desire to upgrade their facilities. And I think that was a question that's been raised a couple of times. How do you actually deal with that issue? And one of the things that we've done is, and you've got to look at each one on an individual basis, but we do have some policy considerations that we developed for dealing with those kinds of situations. First, most importantly, was that we didn't think that an upgrade that delayed the progress of their reconfiguration was a good idea. And so we asked licensees who wanted to upgrade their systems to add, in this case, I guess, new antennas, to make a showing that they can do that along the same time frames as they would have completed their reconfiguration. And secondly, and equally importantly, we wanted to make sure that the costs of any upgrade did not exceed the cost of the reconfiguration, so that the licensee would be required to show that they had funding available to complete the upgrade, and that they would not expect anything beyond what the reconfiguration costs would have been. So I'm not sure that gets directly to the question of specifically broadband or panel antennas, but I would echo what David said about being as flexible as possible of licensees. I mean, you have, and I think I heard this in the first panel, probably an infinite number of permutations of what licensees will face when they do this. I mean, the way I like to say it is, in a program of this size, you see one of everything. And so you really have to be flexible, and you have to be able to accommodate what does come up when it comes up. So,
is it the sense of the panel that we should leave those decisions to the broadcasters, and the question for us is how we accommodate that on the reimbursement side?
Yeah, absolutely, you should leave it to the discretion of the broadcaster. I think if you forced folks to go with a broadband antenna or a paneled antenna, you're going to, it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. The best example I could give you is markets along the northern border. Again, Rochester, Buffalo. You get a sense I'm concerned about these guys. I'm not so sure I know how to cut a single-channel antenna, let alone put a broadband antenna or pay the expense of a broadband antenna until I know what's happening on the other side of the border. And as I understand it, although I know you guys have been working on this, I may not know what has to be protected or not protected on the other side of the border until after this process ends. And so for me to go forward and have, to work with other broadcasters to create something like that, I think is problematic. I mean, there are a number of other issues too if you force it. There are loading issues. There's just a ton of stuff that I'm sure Mark can focus on. So again, if you want to create tools in a toolbox, sure. But I think you have to be very careful about forcing it.
Yeah, I mean, part of the concern with timing, by the way, is that it could take sometimes a year or more of work between a broadcast engineer and an antenna engineer to engineer a solution to all of the constraints that already exist inside of the license. So again, if you don't know the channel and you don't know the surrounding circumstances, you cannot even begin to contemplate the variables until those are known. And then you're looking at a year or more, perhaps in some rough cases. If you look at highly congested markets, both in the east and the west, it's not unusual for a program to take 2 or 3 years before you begin the actual acquisition phase of the process.
To turn more broadly to cost mitigation measures, when a broadcaster contemplates a major purchase, such as a transmitter, an antenna, or an entire facility, do they typically today put that out for competitive bid? And should we require that purchases above a certain amount be put out for bid to ensure that costs are reasonable in the repack?
No.
No. just to add, too, from public broadcasting's perspective, the vast majority of our stations are required to do that as university licensees or state licensees, and many of the community licensees have even adopted those procedures. So given the 3-year time frame and all the other complexities, I don't think the commission should worry about that. And again, I'm going to shake my head no with Mark on that one.
Well, look at. I mean, the fact is the market really has shaped the answer to that environment. When there are only a couple qualified providers, and you've had a 20-year history with a provider, and so you've got a major invested stake in that provider, then to force that broadcaster into a relationship of somebody who he's not chosen on his own for the last 20 years is tantamount to to a forced march. So and the numbers of manufacturers are becoming increasingly small. Again, the freeze, the uncertainty of this auction, the timing of this is serving nobody well, and something has to be done.
Yeah. Can I just add that my answer is also no, but it's no but. And the but is you still are going to have to be able to determine that the costs are reasonable. Mm-hmm. And there are different ways of doing that. I mean, you can, for example, rely upon a licensee's established relationship with a vendor and perhaps their existing contracts. If they're already paying those rates, then that's some evidence of reasonableness. Other ways of doing it is to establish perhaps program metrics or cost data based upon the experience of the industry. And getting the record obviously would be very important on that and your public notice. So there are other ways of establishing reasonableness than just using a competitive procurement. We didn't require that, I think that was a good decision because competitive procurements, particularly when you're doing public sector, can be quite lengthy and open to challenge and cause all kinds of problems. Commercial, right. Obviously, that's a much different matter.
Yeah, my answer to that is no. I think one of the concerns I have is I think you have a good sense of what this market looks like. And to Mark's point, if I have 10 or 12 stations and I generally deal with company X for a transmitter, and I get a certain price, suddenly I'm going to go through a process that may end up with company Y, or what are the factors that go into choosing between X, who I've dealt with for years and supports my system, and company Y, who may happen on this particular day to be the lowest. I think you may actually end up being more expensive. The other concern I have, and I think Robert's touched on it, is that whenever you create this kind of sort of requirement, you're creating a layer of soft costs. Because then you have questions that are raised, then you have lawyers who have to come in to say, was it truly competitive? And all you do, I think, in this instance, is just delay. I understand your statutory obligation, but the costs have to be reasonable. I'm not so sure a mandated approach is necessarily the way to go with this.
Large volume purchases often produce lower prices. Are there, and recognizing that there may be antitrust constraints, are there any lessons from either successes in the DTV transition for commercial stations or the non-commercial stations, or from the 800 megahertz experience, where bulk purchases, cooperative bulk purchases, can be a way of trying to just produce lower prices?
My answer would be that in a commodities market, you may have volume drive substantial discounts, but when almost the entirety of your activity is specialty engineering, for example, you could make a bulk purchase on 100 antennas. Well, those antennas are different diameter steel, different steel type, different just about everything. Bulk purchase the transmission line, well, you're already purchasing on the order of 10,000 foot at a time. The volume discounting that goes into transmission line is relatively small. The discounting, I think, that typically is inherent in this industry is based on being a good customer. It's about wishing to extend goodwill towards that relationship. It has very little to do with actual cost savings associated with bulk purchases.
I think Mark's exactly right. I think one of the concerns we certainly had during the digital transition, and there was no, I mean, there may have been purchases by individual companies because they owned a number of stations, but to the best of my knowledge, and certainly over my dead body, there was no coordination amongst competitors to go after bulk services. The antitrust is a huge issue there, and it would be, I think, problematic to try to go down that road unless there were significant changes made in the law. But to Mark's point, and I think he raises it, I'm not so sure you get that many or you get the significance and savings that you would anticipate. I think the coordination may not necessarily be in the purchasing aspect and things of that nature, but perhaps in the scheduling of services, which is a completely separate issue and a tricky one. But I think that's where the coordination, certainly not in terms of bulk purchases or things of that nature.
Yeah, we've absolutely had some bulk purchasing in the 800 program, and there have been both from equipment and service vendors, and we've had, and to some degree our community is different. The public safety community is very cohesive and close, and they don't have the same kinds of antitrust concerns that David referenced. But in certain regions there have been joint contracts and other sorts of things, and I think that's served well, not only in terms of driving the price. I mean, price is one issue, but also, frankly, in terms of expediting the reconfiguration. And I mean, there's some benefits to that. And I will say, and I understand the broadcast industry is a different animal here, but that I'm not sure I'm completely in agreement with David about the antitrust laws on this. So.
We've had.
Will you defend us pro bono?
Great question.
You won't get in any trouble. So.
Yeah, right.
We've had some success in the past on the public broadcasting side, but those have been circumstances where timing and the funding are on our side. So one great example is the equipment that our stations purchased under the Warning, Alert, and Response Network Act requirements. But in that case, the funding was given as a sole source grant to PBS, who was able to either give the stations the equipment for unique purchases or, if applicable, do bulk purchases. But again, that was a different circumstance. I think ideally the concept works. I don't know if in this situation it will, given the way the funding might flow and the 3-year time frame involved.
There were bulk purchases made in the broadcast BAS relocation. But remember what that was is you had multi-competitive industry working through Sprint, and Sprint was the entity, the single entity, getting involved in the equipment purchases. So it was a vastly different scenario than I think at least what your question contemplated.
Yeah, they were almost a commodity product in that they serviced the same band of frequency, and we're not frequency selective in the same manner that television stations are.
Right.
And the other advantage that you had there is that, as an engineering issue, percentage of bandwidth functionality means that you can cover a relatively broad band of frequencies on a percentage basis that when you move that down to UHF or VHF become single channels or maybe one or two channels.
Exactly.
David, you referred to cooperation in the use of scarce services, and we heard a little bit about that earlier this morning. Can we expect the broadcasters will cooperate in competing for scarce tower crews or engineers, or will we see a sort of an unseemly devil take the hindmost?
No, I think it is an issue that you might want to look at. For example, if you're doing tower work or if you're doing systems integration and it's the winter time, you might as well be in Florida, not upstate New York. But if you're in the summertime, New York makes a lot of sense, including New York City. You have to almost sort of devise a matrix. I think one of the problems you have, and I said why this is very tricky, is that you have entities who have you may have 5 or 6 stations in a market that are ready to go and ready to get the work done, 2 or 3 stations that aren't, and do the 2 or 3 stations hold up the rest that are ready to go? It's not an easy answer by saying on Tuesday you will be here. It is a far more complex and almost iterative process. I mean, you have to almost learn as you go. We were able to do some of that in the BAS relocation, but again, it was vastly different than this transition. We were able to do some market-by-market work there. So I think it's an issue that may be worth exploring, but until we actually get a better feel, and I'm sorry, indeed, even a better feel for what needs to be done on a market-by-market basis, I can't say yes on Tuesday. Let's start. Well, actually, yes, I can. Start with New York City first.
Well, and be mindful of the fact, I think Mike Ravino earlier bringing up the fact that the competition of the resources go far beyond just the reimbursable community of full power broadcasters. Every single issue that I've got a list that's 12 items long, specific to the low power industry, and every one of these issues has the run-on effect to the low power community. So we will be competing. By the way, in some cases, it's easier for a tower rigging company to take on 2 or 3 jobs in mid or small tower sizes, as opposed to taking on a large tower, because the profit margins, quite frankly, are better because there's less involvement. There are less safety issues that are involved. The limitation of one of the limitations that we've got in our industry today is that many of these companies that supplied to the broadcast industry in the current situation ad nauseum have decided that there's more money to be made at better margins with the other wireless guys, and that's where they've gone. So to entice them back to this industry in the notion of a repack probably, quite frankly, will take a premium on existing prices and not some bulk purchase discount.
And let me also just add, it appears that depending on how the proceeding goes with electronic news gathering with ENG and the Department of Defense, you may be in a scenario while you're doing this, you may also have ENG work, which also requires tower work to do. We ran into that the last time, and so now we may be repeating that. That will further drain resources from this project.
One approach we've proposed as a possibility in the notice of proposed rulemaking is that we would advance much of the cost to broadcasters against an estimate of cost for a transition, and then have a true-up later against actual costs. Mm-hmm. Is there any way we could build into that an incentive for broadcasters to come in under their estimate by sharing the cost savings with the broadcaster or some other means?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, but it's how you do it is. Yeah, it's
easy to say yes.
Right.
It's just how you do it.
It's a mechanism that'll be tough, but I do think it's a great idea because I do think there'll be a lot of unknowns. I mean, Dave had mentioned in the previous panel, it was mentioned about fill-in translators, and after the DTV transition, the white areas that occurred that no one had an idea were going to occur. So there will be unknown costs, and broadcasters will. We definitely do not want any white areas in coverage, and so I think if there's a possibility to incentivize broadcasters to come in under cost, also knowing that there'd be some perhaps additional funding from those cost savings that they could apply to those unknown costs that come up, like white areas that weren't expected. I think it's a great idea and one worth exploring.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. At the risk of getting voted off the panel, my answer is maybe, and maybe because first I think you might have a statutory issue on that, but beyond that, you have to make sure whatever incentives you give, you've got to make sure that you don't. What you don't want to do is give the wrong incentives. along with trying to incentivize the broadcasters. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, and it's something that you really have got to think about very carefully, I think.
Well, I said yes in the context that we've certainly responded to the commission directly inside of the the 12268 docket, the notion of give us the right to elect upfront prior to the auction flexible use waivers for all of our stations. So that's 162 out of how many, Bill? And you could save the money for 162 stations by granting that waiver. So that would be one way to incentivize broadcasters to minimize the exposure of which may well be the difference between yes or no completing the auction process to begin with.
David, you mentioned that earlier as well. Given that we have a statute that gives us a 3-year reimbursement period and a statutory limit on the amount of funds available, how do you see that waiver process fitting into the statute as it exists?
Well, I think it's certainly an option. And as I understood the statute, the way it was drafted, it would allow broadcasters to experiment, indeed experiment with new forms of new transmission systems, provided it doesn't cause any interference to its surrounding facilities. And so if it certainly is an option that one could try to pursue and explore, provided, and it's a big proviso, that as we're going through this, depending on what transmission system is adopted or what the interference or what the engineering aspects work. It's there, and it's something that stations are allowed to use and should be allowed to use.
Mark, same question to you. Given the statute as it stands, how do we accommodate that waiver process?
By granting it. I mean, look, as an industry, we've got a history of serving the public. I don't think that I'm not concerned with anarchy taking over in the notion of flex use. Up until the most recent period when we had extended discussions with members of your staff on this word flexible use, I know people like Greg would say I was sort of I wouldn't use that word. What does it really mean? But in the context of being able to provide universal service and access to the American public, I think that a market-driven solution, comes out of opening up the possibility of a waiver in being able to provide a system that fundamentally serves the public in better ways than is possible today. So I think it's to the benefit of the commission to take heed of again this notion, not only ensuring that broadcasting survives, but giving broadcasting the opportunity through the process of this repack and through the process of this massive undertaking, allow broadcasting to provide a better service to the American public on a competitive basis with the other wireless providers.
I'll throw it open now. We're just about out of time to any questions from the audience present.
Well, gosh, yes. Thank you. Another fantastic group of people, an excellent panel. Sorry, I actually was writing this down because I wanted it to be germane to what you guys were discussing. Ms. Thompson, you commented that translators need to be considered in the repack now. Mm-hmm. I would say that goes for low-power television stations, too. They're very close brothers and sisters. Considering the stated and now apparently universal recognition of the necessity to preserve as many secondary broadcasting services, namely the low-power television and translators, what impact would a new, more advanced and robust standard or modulation system have on preserving more LPTV and TV translators? And I'm hoping maybe Mark might have looked into that, or some of you might have. And do you believe fundamentally that more LPTV and TV translator licenses could be saved by using the technology, like ATSC 3.0 or something akin to it? Is preserving those stations, the translators, in the public interest? And if so, how can the industry make sure that all options to preserve LPTV and TV translators are being properly considered in this auction proceeding? So it's a compound question. You take or leave which parts you like.
Is there a question in here?
Yeah, there were 3 questions in there, David.
Mark, I guess my first question is or response is whether you do ATSC 3.0 or the existing transmission standard. I don't know whether one helps or hurts the LPTV industry or process, because the question that I think you all are facing is the FCC's approach, which is I'm not going to protect you or protect translators at all, regardless of the system that you're using or the transmission system you're using. That, I think, is the fundamental issue.
So they're secondary service, but only in terms of the rights, in terms of coverage and interference. Yes. So I would say that in a new advance, and I'm only using ATSC 3.0 because it's sort of commonly known that this next generation activity is underway. But I would, for the record, state that the ability, for example, we know that 30% of our audience in Salt Lake City actually comes from the entire state and 13 surrounding counties. That the ability to deploy a single frequency network would free up a huge amount of spectrum, making that spectrum more available for low powers. So in the process of, and by the way, there are tools at your disposal inside of a next generation standard, in OFDM and what we've learned with OFDMA, the ability to control distinctly different carriers and do an interleaving with respect to interferences means that fundamentally that perhaps you could, as part of that secondary service, allow a tighter spacing. And then you've got all kinds of handles and knobs for forward error correction and guard interval, and you have flexibility. I mean, so the notion of flexible use, I think, the underlying nature of that needs to be how can we devise a way to provide a universal capability that has the flexibility to accommodate the needs of all broadcasters without respect to specific business models and to better serve the public.
Well, being that Mark, you know about as much about the potential of an enhanced modulation system. I'm not going to pick one. You've seen them all, and its impact and deployment as anybody probably in the United States. I guess the core of my second part of the question is we assume that low power TV and translators are good public policy. We shouldn't just wipe them out. We should try to preserve them if we can. It seems, from what I'm hearing from you, the potential exists that we may be able to preserve more of them if we were using a more tolerant or advanced standard that had the capabilities you were just describing.
Absolutely, positively.
And that's the point
There's
I was
no
hoping to make here.
That a fundamental overhaul of the broadcast platform, and I don't just relegate that to modulation. This is not a modulation standards issue. This is an issue of how do we make best use as an industry of the entirety of the spectrum that's been dedicated to broadcast television, and do so in a manner that best serves the American public. All of those things can work together, but it works best in the framework of something other than what we have for a standard today, and live and to disperse $1.75 billion for the purpose of furthering a 20-year-old technology makes absolutely no sense. And I think that if Congress was aware of what they had asked for, they wouldn't have asked for that.
And just to underscore the public policy piece of this, really to put a fine point on it, is we're really talking about folks losing service in many cases to their sole service via translator. We talked about the problem not just being in New Mexico, but also in New York. We have our Reno station serves 27 tribal nations who get their only service via translator. One of our stations in Alaska, KTOO in Juneau, serves 235 communities that get no other service, not just no other public TV service, no other television service, but via translators. I know less about low power, but I agree with you. It's an issue that needs to be front and center, can't be an afterthought. We recognize translators and low power secondary, and they're not included in the reimbursement fund. But that doesn't mean we can't work out answers to make it work. And we cannot deny those people their public television or their commercial television service.
Thank you.
One quick comment on the question of competitive bidding. My name is Peter Tannenwald. I think the panelists made it pretty clear that competitive bidding can be scary, but when it comes to tower work, you need to have the person on your tower who's been on it before. And if you want to have metrics like Bob Kelly talked about so they don't price gouge, that's one thing. But you do not want to put tower work out for bid and have the cheapest guy come along and climb your tower.
Absolutely right, Peter.
Yeah, great point.
We may have time for one more question.
Could I?
Amy Brown, I'm with SpectrumEvolution.org, and Mark wonderfully stole my thunder in the first part of the panel because every FCC open meeting, every Learn workshop, I have always brought up flex use. And my question is, since it has been so prominent today, will there be an NPRM from the FCC about how to utilize flex use and make it beneficial? And wouldn't it make sense that if the waivers that Sinclair is asking for were granted and he was able to prove the benefits of this, that would only encourage the broadcasters during the repack to forego their relocation expenses and move to flex use, which could help save that $1.75 billion. I specifically remember a year ago at the panel you mentioned with Jay Adrick talking about the unforeseen expenses and the grave concern that you're going to run out of money. You laughed, looked at Jane, and said, I guess you need to be prepared to go lobby for more money in Congress. There is a solution, and if there's an NPRM where you allow us to comment on how we think flex use would work, that could be great. So my question is, will there be one coming out soon?
Since we're here to gather information and not to telegraph decisions we haven't made yet, I'll turn that over to the panel and say, should we do what she proposes?
Yes.
I think you have to look at it. I think the bottom line is one of the real issues is, it seems to me, and we really don't know the answer yet, is what do your models look like in terms of assigning stations and doing interference analysis? What does that look like? Would it be different if, in fact, you had flex use? And so, you don't want to, while you want to certainly support flexible use, you want to make sure that your models, if you're going to go forward with this, take that into account, because it may create a very different situation. So that's the ball is back in your court, I think, on that.
Thank you. I want to thank our panelists very much and all of you who came on this, which may be our last day of public business for a while.
Oh.
And,
do you need a ride home, Bill?
I don't go home until tomorrow.
Don't forget to shut off your computer and put on your away message before you go.
Right. Bill, I know you want to close it. Could I just one thought? Sure. Because we had a discussion in the early part of the panel, and it goes to the issue of what is sort of reasonable comparable equipment. Because we ran into this in the BAS scenario, in which on day one you buy certain equipment, and then 6 months later, a new version or a new piece of equipment comes out. And is that comparable, or is it comparable to what's already in there? And I would urge you to look at that very, very carefully, because what we found is when you get newer versions of equipment, remember the equipment market is not only supporting what you're doing here, but it's also supporting a much larger market, and it actually may be more expensive to take out features to make it, quote, comparable to what was there before, than it would simply to let it go through in the market. I mean, it's a very tricky question, but it's one that as you're going forward with this, just because equipment you may be buying may be updated or to have more features, that it may be more expensive if you try to stop it and compare it to what was already in the market 10, 20 years ago.
I recognize that's an issue we face in any dynamic market. I think someone said that Steve Jobs was famous for making you hate your Christmas present. By coming out with a new version.
Right, and if you take it out, it'll be more expensive, because now you're creating a one-off.
Thank you so much. We found this very helpful, and I hope all the interested parties will find it helpful in crystallizing thoughts and formulating comments, which we very much want to receive in response to the PN we put out. Thanks again.